had an interesting history with the Tales series, which I've heard amongst the JRPG fans as the Assassin's Creed of the JRPGs. Can't imagine why. Look at those freaking release dates. They're releasing these games almost every year. They don't do it as often now. It's been 3 years since the last Tales game, but god damn, Banco. Anyway, my history with the Tales series began with what the fans consider to be the weirdest entry of the series, Legendia. Now, I remembered liking Legendia. I say that because it's been a while since I played it. It was on a PS2 and I was in elementary school, I think. Legendia was a game that I forgot I actually played for quite a while, but I did remember having fun with it, so there's that. Years later, I'm a fully fledged adult and I've gotten myself into the JRPG scene. Thank you, Persona 4. So why didn't I get myself into Tales when I'm at it, especially when they're on PC now? The first Tales game that I played after years later was Tales of Symphonia for the PC. Not exactly the best PC port. Actually, the PC port is rather rubbish, but it is a pretty damn good game. Beyond all of that colorful, lighthearted, fantasy, anime JRPG stuff, the game hides a rather terrifying story involving very heavy themes such as racism, genocide, the corruption of the gods and angels, human experiments that turn people into horrendous abominations begging you to euthanize them. It's a game presenting itself as a lighthearted JRPG of your very young shonen protagonist escorting the chosen one to save the world, but that journey is compounded with something sinister and dark creeping upon you. Symphonia was an experience unlike anything that I've played, a JRPG that makes me laugh but also unnerves me. A lot of the story elements are straight out of a horror flick, and the game's deconstructive nature of the chosen one storyline helps a lot more in making the world darker and edgier. But that being said, it is rather difficult to recommend this game, mostly because for a 15-plus-year-old game, it really shows its age. The RPG elements are simplistic, the combat was pretty clunky, and the puzzles are stupidly annoying. While I personally have quite a lot of fun with Symphonia, I think anyone who is interested to get into the JRPG scene would need to tolerate a lot of the game's really outdated elements. If you're able to get past through that, it's an excellent JRPG, and I would personally give Symphonia 4 caps out of 5. The next one that I played was Vesperia, and despite being one of the most popular entry in the series, I was quite underwhelmed by Vesperia. It has significantly better combat, but the story isn't as interesting, and they dumped off one of the interesting female characters in favor of one that is not as interesting. I wanted to try at least continue on that game further, but I'm just really not that interested. I do have Berseria on my back burner, but Vesperia Definitive Edition is right here, and people say that it's one of the good Tales games, so what better way to go back to Tales than in this current time? Welcome to Appleben's Uncapped. And yes, they do bounce. Today, our review is going to be on Tales of Vesperia Definitive Edition, the HD remastered version of the JRPG Tales of Vesperia that used to be released on the Xbox 360 around 11 years ago as an Xbox 360 exclusive outside of Japan. That's a pretty long damn time. But thankfully, it's not long enough to make this game look outdated. It still has Symphonia's clunky combat system, but let's get to that later. All of these Tales games take place in a different universe each, and they contain standalone storylines just like the Persona games. The ones that I played are mostly centered on the theme of saving the world. Symphonia, you're a guy tasked to escort the chosen one into saving the world. Zestiria, you are the shepherd and you are the only one who can interact with the seraphims to save the world. Vesperia, some prick stole a magical artifact and you're gonna get it. Not exactly as grand, I know, but it is simple and to the point. None of the pretentious saving the world BS, just normal everyday people in a fantasy world doing normal everyday stuff. That is until we get to the very end of the game, which we still do end up saving the world from evil conspiracies, corrupt governments, and the flaws within the system. You play as Yuri Lowell, some easygoing troublemaking prick whose name might suggest that he's going to be voiced by Yuri Lowenthal, right? Nope, he's voiced by Troy Baker of all people.
That's weird.
But still, somebody stole a magical artifact called the Blastia Core, which caused quite a massive flood in the lower quarters of the capital. He was tasked to take it back from the douchebag who stole it, but he got himself into a bunch of complications that put him into jail. On his escape, he got himself involved in an assassination attempt towards his best friend and the Royal Knight Flynn for reasons that are not known yet, and somehow the princess is involved in this conspiracy. Together, they escape the Imperial City to find the guy who stole the Blastia Core and unravel a giant conspiracy of world dominations and ancient prophecies that will destroy the world as we know it. When people say that the Tales games are the Assassin's Creed of JRPGs, I can see why. There's not a lot of change between this game and Symphonia was released 5 years before this game. There are some tweaks in the combat system and the UI, and it does look pretty, but I'm essentially playing Symphonia again. And if you want to know my opinion on Symphonia's gameplay, while I still think that it has a fantastic story, Symphonia's gameplay is a bit tricky to get into. The combat system in the game is pretty much like your typical action RPG, but you're restricted to a constrained 2D space with just one enemy, kind of like a fighting game. Yes, you can move freely in 3D, but it is still pretty awkward, difficult, and most of the time, I don't really feel like I'm in control of the character. It's a combat system that just never clicks on me. Maybe it might work for you, but there's a bit of an adapting curve here that I think a lot of newcomers would find difficult to click in. If you think that the combat system is a bit too awkward, you can just turn on the auto mode and let the AI to fight themselves. The game also has its own tactics preset, which you can modify at any time, at any point in the game, to your advantage. It's a pretty damn deep and convenient mechanics that add a lot more into the game's seemingly mindless combat. Utilizing all of these tactics is a must in your survival against many of the game's enemies. The one thing that I hate from Symphonia is those obnoxious freaking puzzle sections that I swear to God goes on for quite a while. It happens in almost every new area you encounter, and it eats up a good chunk of my entire freaking playthrough. Thankfully, Vesperia wises up from that philosophy of slapping the players with obnoxious puzzles every single time they come to a new area by slapping the players with obnoxious puzzles at the very end parts of the game. And significantly easier puzzles, so major improvements there. While this is still a definitive edition of a pretty popular and well-respected game, the gameplay is still on a state that is pretty difficult to recommend if you want to get into JRPGs. JRPG enthusiasts will absolutely love this game for sure, but we need to also judge this game based on its accessibility towards the newcomers. And while a lot of the RPG elements are pretty basic and straightforward, like the items, the upgrade system, and the status ailments, etc., the combat system is the main meat of the game, and to me at least, it's not exactly that friendly for the newcomers, or at least it's gonna take some time for you to get into the groove and find the most appropriate playstyle for you. If you can get over the combat system that takes a bit of time to get used to, the content of a typical Tales game isn't entirely the combat. Now let's talk about the actual main meat of the game, which is the story, the characters, the lore, etc. A lot of people say that Vesperia is one of the best games in the series, and just on the first 4 hours, I can totally see why. Out of all the Tales protagonists that I've played so far, I think Yuri is my favorite. He always has a very chill and not giving a crap attitude that makes him incredibly likable. He knows how to prank people, but he's also kind and generous. He's quite a troublemaker, but he also has a heart of gold. He doesn't really fit into any of the typical anime or JRPG shonen protagonist trope. In fact, he reminds me so much of Spike from Cowboy Bebop, and Spike isn't your typical anime protagonist. The rest of the characters are amazing as well, and brilliantly developed. Like Symphonia, the real protagonist here is the lead female protagonist, Estelle, who becomes a part of an even bigger picture that determines the fate of the entire world. Her role is essentially to be a walking encyclopedia for the game's world, but she also has to play the role of the student as well, as she learns more about humanity, how the world works, and her major role in its fate. The world is gonna be in her hands at some point in her life, but she's too isolated in her castle to know anything about it, so the entire story is about her trying to learn more about the world around her. One of the things that I love about Symphonia is that it has the balls to deal with some really heavy themes like racism, genocide, really messed up science experiments using humans as guinea pigs, the gods of the world being insanely corrupt. It has everything. Despite the game's rather innocent presentation with the anime style, the game is actually pretty dark in terms of its themes. Fans of games with hidden depths will absolutely appreciate Symphonia for it. Vesperia, well, it doesn't really have that edge, unfortunately. I feel like Vesperia is leaning a bit more into the lighthearted side, which I don't mind. The Tales games always have great comedies, great characters, and amazing skits that never get old every single time. But I think my expectations on the Tales games have gotten a bit more unrealistic since Symphonia. Symphonia is a lighthearted JRPG with hidden darkness and depth, while Vesperia is a pretty straight-faced JRPG if I have to be honest with you. Now don't get me wrong, it does deal with complex themes, mostly centered around politics, the glaring flaws of the system, and fantasy conspiratorial intrigues. All of these things add more depth into the game's world, and they do put a lot of the characters characters in morally gray dilemmas. There are even actions in the latter parts of the game, which I won't spoil, that puts the main character into some morally questionable territories. But still, it isn't as dark or as complex as Symphonia, and while the themes that it explores are quite intriguing, it is something that I've already seen in many JRPGs out there. But still, just because it isn't anything innovative doesn't mean that it isn't good, and Vesperia's story is good. It's intriguing, it's easy to follow, and it kept me on my toes. I really like how the game starts off very simple with a quest on retrieving the Blastia core. It's pretty simple, but then it snowballs into bigger and bigger stories until you finally get into being a part of the giant world-ending prophecy, just like any other Tales games. The pacing works well, and the game manages to introduce a lot of its lore elements pretty well, feeding you information at a steady pace. When the characters are spouting lore babble or techno babble at the end, I understood exactly what they mean because the game introduced the lore pretty well. That being said, I do have some issues with the story, namely that the third and final act of the story isn't that great. Vesperia thinks that it can just copy and paste what we did at the end of Symphonia and think that I wouldn't notice. And speaking of the final act, the epilogue is lacking punch, making me feel a bit disappointed finishing it rather than satisfied. And considering that this is a definitive edition, let's talk about the PC port. The Tales games unfortunately have a very dodgy history with its PC ports. Thankfully, the game's PC port is excellent. While this game does support mouse and keyboard, I do recommend playing it with a controller. The game runs pretty damn well, which isn't surprising considering that this game is around 10 years old. It has to run damn well. I'm running this game on an Asus ROG GL553VD laptop with the specs as follows. It runs at solid 60 FPS at 1080p in the highest settings. Definitely much better optimized than Symphonia was. I'm confident that the game is well optimized enough to run at lower end hardware, so if you don't have an Xbox One, a PS4, or a Nintendo Switch even, yes, the game is on the Switch, you should be able to experience the game just fine on your potato PC, but do check the system requirements to see if your rig can run this game. The graphical settings are pretty basic, nothing too spectacular about it, but it will give you quite a room for improving your frame rates. Overall, Vesperia doesn't have that dark edge that makes Symphonia so special for me at least, but it is still a pretty solid JRPG all around, with a great story and a great cast. If you can get past through the clunky combat system that takes a bit of time to get used to, this game is going to be a blast, and I do recommend it if you're into this sort of thing. It's a JRPG that plays a lot of its tropes straight, but it does the job competently, and for that, I'm giving this one 4 blue caps out of 5. It's a pretty solid JRPG all around. It isn't as dark and edgy as Symphonia, which is a shame for me, but it has a much better PC port, and there are significantly less obnoxious puzzles, so that one should definitely be put as a selling point. Now let's talk about the price. At $50 on Steam, this game is a pretty tough buy, I have to admit. It definitely has 50 plus hours of content, but it's not gonna be the sorts of thing that I would get to immediately. Don't grab it now if you don't have the money, but if you do, and you are legitimately interested in this game, it is definitely a solid purchase. If you're brand new to JRPGs, I wouldn't exactly recommend this game. It takes a bit of time to get used to with the combat system, but if you can move past that, this game has tons and tons of story content that would definitely make you laugh and cry as well. At the end of the day, it's a pretty good JRPG game, and I can't ask for any more than that.